Hello, and welcome to the Geopolitics Explained podcast. This is the podcast that delves into the intricate world of global politics of the past and present, while also exploring potential possibilities for what tomorrow could bring. I'm your host, Dylan, and in each episode here of the Geopolitics Explained podcast, we'll break down complex issues into small, understandable chunks through in-depth scenario analysis. So come and join us as we navigate the ever-changing landscape of international relations, uncovering the stories behind the headlines and predicting the trends that could shape the future of our world. And this has been recorded on the 18th of October 2024. Now, some conflicts around the world are covered in immense detail. We've had this with the war in Ukraine, and today we have it with the current conflict occurring in the Middle East. This often runs as a defining narrative in the mainstream media. As a consequence of this approach, stories that deserve just as much attention often receive very little. One such area where this is prevalent is in the current civil war occurring in Sudan. Now, in this podcast episode, as we break down what's occurring in Sudan, I'll explore the history of Sudan, the first and second Sudanese civil wars, and what has occurred in the last few years in Sudan to contribute to the civil war that we see today. With the River Nile flowing through Sudan, its history is rich. Back when we couldn't travel in cars and planes, many ancient civilizations were centred around the valuable necessity of water. The first documented activity in this area was related to the kingdoms of Kush and Nubia, who traded with ancient Egypt as far back as 2700 BC. Trade developed over the centuries, with the region rich in gold, incense and hides. It wasn't until 2100 BC that permanent settlements were built in the region. With ancient Egypt existing for almost 3 millennia, they heavily influenced the region of Sudan and its ancient history, and hence also continue to influence the area today. This region in the past has also been controlled by the Iranians, the Greeks and the Romans. In the year 350, the kingdom of Aksum existed to the east. They captured and destroyed the capital city of Meroe, marking the end of the kingdom of Kush. In its place rose 3 kingdoms in what we know today as Sudanese territory. These regions were named Mercuria, Nobatia and Alodia. In the 6th century, we saw these kingdoms convert to Christianity, and Nobatia was incorporated into Mercuria, leaving only Mercuria and Alodia as the kingdoms remaining. When we combine these kingdoms, they were known as the Christian Nubian kingdoms. Now, these kingdoms were subjected to attacks from the Rashidun Caliphate in the 7th century. Interestingly, the Rashidun Caliphate was the first caliphate to succeed the Prophet Muhammad, and they conquered Byzantine-led Egypt in the year 641. However, when the caliphate came and attempted to conquer the Nubian kingdoms resisted their attack. Eventually, a non-aggression pact with an annual exchange of gifts was established, and independence for the Nubian kingdoms was acknowledged. During this period of peace, the Nubian kingdoms experienced their golden age, which occurred between the 8th and 11th century. This came before the 12th century, when the kingdoms finally started to decline. By the 14th century, many smaller tribes had taken advantage of this decline, and a century later, in the 15th century, we saw the collapse of the Nubian kingdoms. During this period, the Christian Nubian kingdoms resisted the expansion of Islam that was occurring around them, but this wasn't set to last. with the Middle East located in geographical proximity to Sudan, and as trade rose in the region, also did Arab influence. Hence, in the 1500s, we saw the Funj and Darfur sultanates arise. These sultanates then continued to exist in the region for a few centuries. In the 1800s, the Egyptians were rising in power under a leader called Ali Pasha. This is also something that I discussed during my series that I did on the Balkans over on my Substack. In the 1820s, the Egyptians expanded to the south, wishing to take Sudan for security against rivals, while also wishing to exploit its natural resources. Egypt and Ali Pasha achieved just this, taking control of the region that we know as Sudan today. Now, a little bit more background into Ali Pasha and his leadership in Egypt. In 1833, we saw the Greek War of Independence. This occurred between the Greeks and the Ottomans. Now, Ali Pasha, the Egyptian leader, supported the Ottomans during this war, but in return, he wanted control of modern-day Syria, which at the time was controlled by the Ottomans. Now, I'd recommend reading my series on the Balkans for more details into this conflict, but eventually, the Egyptians attempted to take the area forcefully after the Ottomans didn't grant them this wish. This led to many conflicts between the Egyptians and the Ottomans at a time when the Ottomans were in decline. This saw the Egyptians often be quite successful in their pursuits against the Ottomans. Now, around the same time, discontent started to build within Sudan. The Mahdist revolt started in 1881 and lasted for close to 2 decades. This eventually led to the joint Ottoman-Egyptian regime that had been ruling in Sudan being overthrown, and the Mahdist state was established. Now, this didn't last too long, and in 1898, the Mahdist state collapsed. This did, however, highlight the Sudanese hope of ousting foreign influence and taking control of its own future. After the collapse of the Mahdist state, we saw the British and the Egyptians take control of Sudan at the turn of the century, and this occurred until the Sudanese gained independence from the British in 1956. As I discussed in the intro, since this time, we've seen 2 civil wars and the rise of Omar al-Bashir, who ended up ruling in Sudan for 30 years. Before we get on to discussing Omar al-Bashir, I'm going to discuss the First Sudanese Civil War. The First Sudanese Civil War took place between 1955 and 1972, lasting over 16 years. It was fought between the northern regions in Sudan and what we know today as South Sudan. Prior to the South Sudanese independence, which I'll discuss later on, this issue of conflict between the North and the South plagued the country for decades. The conflict had actually started before Sudan gained independence from Anglo-Egyptian colonial control, but the autonomy did see the conflict escalate as the power vacuums that emerged when the British and the Egyptians departed saw many smaller factions vying to fill these vacuums and take control of power. The groups in the north typically viewed the British and the Egyptians more favourably than the south, and hence the North blamed the conflict on the South's grievances against former British control. However, when the British had left, the South were heavily underrepresented in the newly established government, and so the South wanted to challenge this new ruling government. They were an ethnic and a religious minority within the state of Sudan at the time, and they were heavily under-supported by the government. The conflict that occurred during the First Sudanese Civil War is typically marked in 4 stages. Firstly, we had the occurrence of guerrilla warfare, which led to the Anyanya insurgency. Political strife followed this, and then the South Sudan Liberation Movement was formed. Now, of course, this is an incredibly simplified version of what occurred over 16 years of conflict. The main takeaway from this is that no permanent solution was reached. The Addis Ababa Agreement was formed at the end of the conflict in 1972, but it just marked a stalemate. There was nothing permanent about this solution. The Southern Sudan Autonomous Region was established, but this period that provided some additional powers to the south was temporary. In 1983, we saw the Sudanese president Gafar Nimieri abolish the region, and hence unfolded the Second Sudanese Civil War. The Second Sudanese Civil War lasted even longer than the first, occurring from 1983 to 2005. This is a period of over 21 years. The Islamic groups in the north were once again deemed unsupportive of the non-Islamic majority in the Southern Sudan Autonomous Region. Hence, President Nimeri's 1983 declaration that stated that all of Sudan was an Islamic state certainly caused some unrest in the south. The first action of the conflict saw the Sudanese military raid the towns of Bor and Pibor in South Sudan. The Sudan People's Liberation Army was formed soon after in an attempt to re-establish the South's autonomy. A coup in Sudan in 1985 changed leadership in Sudan, but the situation between Sudan and South Sudan remained volatile. The 1983 constitution, formed during Nimieri's presidency, was suspended, and a 1986 election saw power handed over to a civilian government. Peace attempts were made during this time, but in 1989 we saw the rise of Omar al-Bashir, who I mentioned earlier. He replaced the civilian government with the formation of his own military junta, and he made himself self-appointed president, prime minister, chief of state, and chief of the armed forces. At this time, the south controlled many areas, including the Upper Nile, Equatoria, and the Bahr al-Ghazal provinces, as well as parts of Darfur, Kordofan, and the Blue Nile. But a 1992 offensive by Sudan saw the south lose much of this territory that it had gained, and they also lost control of their own headquarters. Now, over the following decade, the conflict remained volatile, and the south continued to be massively suppressed. It took until 2003 for peace to finally start getting discussed, but it wasn't signed until 2 years later, in January of 2005. With the end of the Second Sudanese Civil War, we saw the terms of the peace deal ensuring that autonomy for South Sudan would be granted for 6 years before a referendum would be held on their independence in 2011. As we now know today, this referendum passed. South Sudan gained independence and the country now exists. Although the South gained independence in 2011, this didn't stop the conflict in Sudan. The instability in the region saw multiple opposition groups arise, which still exist today. Two such groups, the Sudan Liberation Movement and the Justice and Equality Movement, fought against the Sudanese government in 2003. In 2006, the Darfur Peace Agreement was signed, but the Justice and Equality Movement group rejected the agreement and fighting restarted a few months later. This trend of an agreement being made and not being held up is a key issue in this conflict that continues to rage today. In 2009, the ICC issued an arrest warrant for al-Bashir, but it would be another decade before al-Bashir was finally no longer in control in Sudan. Al-Bashir being removed from power started in 2018, when protests erupted over the economic situation in Sudan. Protests eventually marked another coup occurring in Sudan in what was called the Sudanese Revolution. Al-Bashir was removed from power and arrested, and a few months later, the Transitional Military Council was formed. The aim of this council was to undergo a process towards a civilian democracy, and there were some positive signs, but in 2021 we saw yet another coup unfold, this time led by General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, who is the current leader of the Sudanese Armed Forces and is de facto leader in Sudan today. This coup was the trigger that once again saw Sudan devolve into another political crisis and another civil war. This has been another episode of the Geopolitics Explained podcast. I want to thank you all for listening. I greatly appreciate it. If you enjoyed this episode, why not leave a review on the podcast platform of your choice? There is a lot more content over on Substack, where I release written pieces twice a week. You can find the link for this in the description of this episode. Once again, I've been Dylan. Until next time.